Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to focus on spending on public services and talk about the profile for that now and how that compares to what we might have expected before yesterday's announcement. So I'm going to start by looking at what central government spends, either directly or via grants to local authorities, on day-to-day spending on public services. And you can see that in real terms over time, shown in this slide here. So sharp cuts in the first 2 years of the coalition government, and spending has been cut more gradually over time since then. If we look in the March 2017 budget, that implied that actually spending would be relatively stable this year before cuts would resume over the following 2 years. And the figures announced yesterday suggest some changes from that. In 2016-17, there was actually a bigger underspend than what the OBR had been expecting. So in terms of total spending on departmental spending, about £3.5 billion less spending than what the OBR had forecast, of which about £2 billion, just over half, translated into an underspend on day-to-day spending. And as a result of that, they've decided to downgrade spending this year. They're assuming there'll be a bigger underspend by government departments again in the current year, offset slightly by some additional money that Philip Hammond to the NHS. In 2018-19 and 2019-20, some additional money has been made available to the NHS as well. And in addition, over those 2 years, a total of £3 billion is going to be made available to government departments to help them prepare for Brexit. We don't know yet which departments will get the money, but that's how much money the Chancellor has set aside. And a further change in 2019-20 is that George Osborne had previously set out a planned efficiency review, which was going to find some savings in 2019-20. Philip Hammond yesterday announced that the kind of hope for that efficiency review has been scaled back a little bit. So, loosely speaking, in 2019-20, the government's now planning to spend a little bit more on waste than what it thought before yesterday. You can see towards the end of the forecast horizon, spending not been topped up by quite as much. And then there's a key... Don't press that one. Then there's a key change in the last year of the Then there's a key change in the last year of the forecast horizon, where we got the new year, 2022-23, and what the Chancellor chose to do is pencil in another year of a real freeze to day-to-day spending on public services. So the era of public spending constraint gets extended by one further year. And as I'll go on to show in a moment, that's particularly challenging in a context where the population is growing, it's aging, there's clearly increasing demands for public services. So that's the latest figures for day-to-day spending on government departments. How does that compare to previous forecasts? Well, if we go back to the budget of March 2013, well, this suggested that the cuts that we'd experienced over the sort of first year or two from 2010 were going to continue. So those cuts would continue going forwards. If we look in March 2014, again, those cuts were going to continue right the way through to 2018-19. So the year in which we'd expect those cuts to stop was pushed back by one further year. In March 2015, the budget before the 2015 election, at last, perhaps the end of austerity may have been in sight. George Osborne's budget implied a tick up in spending in 2019-20. We get to the other side of the election, and actually what Mr. Osborne chose to do is to spend a lot more on public services than what had been implied by the pre-election forecast. So he topped up spending in the near terms, and that tick up in spending was pushed back to 2020-21. And if we look at the forecast since then, we now see there is no tick up in spending at any point on the forecast horizon. So I think there's two lessons from this. Firstly, spending around sort of years around now over time has been increased as we move forwards. So it'll be interesting to see whether there are further top-ups to spending in, say, 2019-20 or 2020-21 as we get closer to those years. And secondly, the year at which kind of public spending is forecast to grow in line with the economy rather than be frozen in real terms, well, that seems to keep being pushed back. And will that continue to be pushed back as the forecasts continue to evolve? So day-to-day spending on public services by central government falling in real terms. If we look at it per capita, the fall is even bigger because the population has been growing. So in the current financial year, spending per head in real terms is currently about 10% down on its 2007-8 level. And the forecasts going forwards now imply a 3.2% cut. So you can see even in that last year of the forecast, where spending's forecast to be constant in real terms, it's falling in per capita terms because of that growth in the population. So that's clearly going to be challenging to deliver even those plans. And of course, you might say, well, you don't want to do that. You don't want to be cutting per capita spending in real terms. What would it cost not to do that? Well, if you wanted to keep per capita spending at around its current level, you'd need to find an additional £10 billion. So it's clearly not an end to austerity, at least on this measure. Now, one of the biggest areas of public spending is the NHS, and that's one of the areas which got allocated additional funds yesterday. So the dark green line here shows, after economy-wide inflation, what we were planning to spend on the NHS as of the March budget, and the green line here shows the top-up that Mr. Hammond announced yesterday. So, for example, in 2019-20, he allocated an extra £1.6 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. It's got to be put in the context of an NHS budget of about £125 billion. Looking further ahead, the Conservative Party manifesto commits them to increase spending on the NHS by about £8 billion over this Parliament. We think they've got about another £5 billion to go to get there. But actually, the course of spending they're on at the moment puts them on a trajectory where they should get there. So it looks like their NHS spending plans are broadly on course to meet the manifesto commitment that they set. But here I think it's important to remember that even meeting that manifesto commitment doesn't imply good times for the NHS. The increases in spending that the NHS is getting are far, far below what it was used to in previous years. So this graph goes right the way back to the late 1950s and looks at the increase in NHS spending after economy-wide inflation in each year. So you can see there are occasional years where the NHS budget is not increased by very much. There's some years even when the NHS budget has been cut. But at the moment, we're in a run of years where it's getting increasingly a long while ago that the NHS enjoyed those kind of good years of spending. And if we look at the average annual increase over a 10-year period, well, consistently over at the moment and over the years to come, if these plans are delivered, will be consistently in the toughest decade for the NHS. It's kind of, at a similar level to the kind of 10-year low that was reached in the mid-1980s. So clearly not an easy settlement for the NHS, even with the additional money that was made available to it yesterday. Now, the NHS is seeing a more generous increase in its budget than many other public services. If we look at NHS spending in per capita terms, I said before, for total spending by central government, that's falling. For the NHS, per capita spending is actually going up. But the NHS doesn't just face pressures because the number of people in the country is increasing. It also faces pressures because the average age of the population is going up. We've got the baby boomers moving through retirement, approaching the point of their lives where they're putting increasing demands on the NHS. So if we adjust the NHS budget, not just for the number of people in the country, but also for the age of those people, we can see that the increases in NHS spending look far less generous. And in fact, per capita age-adjusted spending on the NHS is pretty much flat, and will be pretty flat even if the Conservative manifesto commitment is delivered. So clearly a difficult period for NHS spending. But I've said that in per capita terms, the NHS budget is going up, and overall, public service spending by central government is falling. So if we look at day-to-day spending by central government on public services, we've got a 3.2% cut to per capita spending over 5 years, whereas in terms of day-to-day spending on the NHS, we've got a 2.4% increase in per capita spending. Bear in mind that once you age adjust, that's broadly constant. So that implies that outside of the NHS, if these plans are to be kept to, other areas of spending are going to see their day-to-day spending in per capita terms cut by more. The cut is actually around twice the average at about 6.5%. Now, supposing you wanted to go ahead with the increase in NHS spending that the Chancellor set out yesterday, you wanted to meet that Conservative manifesto commitment, but you also wanted to not be cutting other day-to-day spending in per capita terms, well, then you'd need to find an additional £13 billion from somewhere to end austerity on this definition. So I'm now going to turn to talk about public sector pay, which is clearly an issue which affects the NHS and other public sector employers. So the graph here takes average hourly wages amongst public sector workers and compares it to average hourly wages amongst private sector workers. So the graph is always positive. That shows that on average, public sector workers get paid more per hour than private sector workers. Now, that's not surprising. They have, on average, higher levels of education. So, for example, you would expect a surgeon to get paid more than the average private sector worker. You can also see that public sector pay restraint since 2010 has brought this ratio back to the kind of pre-crisis level. So it's unwound the unintended increase in public sector pay relative to private sector pay that occurred during the Great Recession. But if we took policy as of March 2017, with the public sector pay cap in place, we would have seen this ratio be on a course where it was going to continue falling and fall below anything that we've seen for the last 20 years. Clearly, this would risk problems of recruitment and retention within the public sector growing and making it increasingly difficult for the government to deliver the public services that it wants. Yesterday, Philip Hammond announced that the public sector pay cap in formal terms has been lifted, and the OBR revised up its forecast for wage growth in the public sector. So if they're right, public sector wages will now follow this path relative to private sector wages. Fall slightly, but roughly stabilise around the current level. You might think if that money's spent well, recruitment and retention problems might remain around their current levels. So that's all good news. The difficult thing is it costs money, an additional £2.8 billion in 2020-21. So then the question is, where's the £2.8 billion coming from? So our calculations, based on those OBR forecasts, suggest you might need to find £2.8 billion in 2020-21. It's quite hard to attribute that to different public sector employers, but roughly speaking, we think about £0.9 billion is affecting the NHS, £0.8 billion schools, and £1.1 billion other public sector employers. So the question really is, will the additional funds, if these pay awards are made, will the additional funds come from the Treasury, or will public sector employers have to find it from their existing budgets? And so far, the Treasury commitment to funds has only covered NHS workers under the Agenda for Change contracts. So that's about 3/4 of NHS staff costs. It includes nurses. That's about £0.7 billion, roughly speaking. So that's £0.7 billion, but it's not in the forecasts that were produced yesterday. And it also raises the question about what about the other £2.1 billion? If public sector pay is going to grow in line with the OBR's forecast, is that money going to come out of existing budgets, or will the Treasury dip into its pockets to find more to top those settlements up? And finally, I want to talk about public sector investment spending. So the chart here takes total public sector investment spending in net terms over time and graphs it as a share of GDP. And we can plot onto here the latest forecasts that were presented yesterday. Now, if we ignore the blip up caused by the Great Recession, what we can see is that if the Chancellor manages to deliver the planned spending that he set out, actually we'd get investment spending up to a level that hasn't been sustained at any point over the last 40 years. So in some sense, what it looks like is the challenge isn't really to find more funding for public sector investment. The challenge for the government really is to make sure that that money is actually spent, and make sure that money is actually spent well. And this kind of increase in capital spending we can also see in terms of what's it doing to how we're funding our public services. I've already told you there's a squeeze on day-to-day spending in public services. We're also increasing capital spending. So that means that the share of spending that's going on public services is going to be increasingly capital focused. So it's going to climb from a low of about 12%, 13% in 2012-13, on these figures up to about 17% of total budgets by the end of this decade. So to conclude, yesterday Mr. Hammond found some additional funding for the NHS in the next couple of years, and also an additional £3 billion to be allocated to government departments over 2 years to help them prepare for Brexit. The squeeze on day-to-day spending by central government departments has been extended to 2022-23. Now, a real freeze to spending while the population is growing, that's implying a cut to real spending per capita of 3.2%. Maintaining it at its current level would have cost him £10 billion. We don't know beyond 2019-20 how that's going to be allocated across departments, but we do have a Conservative Party manifesto commitment to increase NHS spending. If they meet that and keep to these spending plans, areas of spending outside of the NHS will have to be cut by 6.5% in per capita after inflation terms. If you didn't want to do that, if you wanted to maintain it at its current level, you'd need to find £13 billion. The public sector pay cap has been lifted. We don't know what's going to happen to public sector wages as a result, but looking at the OBR forecasts, it may imply that an additional £2.8 billion will be needed in 2020-21. As yet, the Treasury is only committed to finding £0.7 billion of that. And looking at the investment figures, actually, if they're delivered, that implies an increase in investment spending that's actually quite high compared to at least recent UK history. Thank you very much.